Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management Webinar Series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the Program Manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. Before we get started with the presentation, we will extend a special thanks to Bob Hollis of the Mobius Network for providing the webinar management software for this series. The focus of today's webinar is on steel recycling. Our presenter today is David Keeling, who I will introduce in a moment. Following his presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you're experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and PA Recycling Market Center websites. The presentation slides can also be obtained using the handout upload feature on your webinar control panel. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. David Keeling is a Director Recycling for the Steel Recycling Institute, also known as SRI. Mr. Keeling has been with SRI in various positions since 1990. Prior to joining the SRI, Mr. Keeling worked in various positions at Central Steel and Wire in Chicago, Illinois. Mr. Keeling's recycling-related responsibilities include working on the regional, state, county, and community levels to maximize steel recycling efforts, as well as expand the steel recycling infrastructure and developing additional end markets for post-consumer steel. He currently serves as president of the National Recycling Coalition. He's chair of the Wisconsin Council on Recycling. He's a secretary of the Illinois Recycling Association and vice chair of the Cooperative Training and Recycling Assistance, a cooperative marketing organization for rural communities based in Austin, Texas. He also serves as a board member of the Southeast Recycling Development Council and as an advisory member of the Northeast Recycling Council and the Toxics and Packaging Clearinghouse. Mr. Keeling is a member of every viable state recycling organization across the country. His construction-related responsibilities require him to serve as an informational resource about the sustainable attributes of steel construction to the building community. His main focus has been to foster and expand his relationships with the staff, leadership, and members of the local chapters of the U.S. Green Building Council and other construction-related organizations. He's a lead accredited professional in the United States Green Building Council and is a member of every local U.S. GBC chapters throughout the country. He's a former executive director of the Midwest Steel Framing Alliance and also serves on the AISI Construction Sustainability Council. Mr. Keeling holds a BS in marketing from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. He currently serves as chair of the Phi Sigma Epsilon National Education Foundation, which supports sales and marketing education and provides scholarships to college students interested in sales and marketing careers. And he's past national president of the Phi Sigma Epsilon Inc. And now I'm going to turn the program over to David.
Well, thank you, Wayne. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon. I'm going to briefly talk about our association, our parent company, American Iron and Steel Institute, and then we'll get right into it. AISI has been around since 1855, American Iron and Steel Institute, and the Steel Recycling Institute is part of that. AISI is an umbrella organization with many groups under that umbrella. As you can see, there's about 21 member companies, both integrated and electric arc furnace steel makers, all throughout North America that belong to AISI. There's about 100 facilities across the country that produce about 81 million tons of steel, worth over $75 billion to our economy. We directly employ about 143,000 people and then another million indirectly. If you can think of your automobile industries and your construction industries, things like that. Also, this last point on this slide is very important. Since the 1980s, we've invested a tremendous amount of financial resources in technology to decrease the amount of worker hours per ton it takes to make a finished ton of steel. We went from 10.1 man hours per ton to 1.9, which makes us one of the most efficient steel producing industries countries in the world. Here's a list of all the AISI producer members, both the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We also have about 120 associate members. As you can see by the diversity of our member companies, the current trade issues that we hear about in the news makes it very interesting for our association in terms of trying to walk that fine line between supporting the various tariff moves to enhance our industry, at the same time being cognizant of our Canadian and our Mexico members from Mexico. An interesting fact about the AISI, we own the Steel Mark logo, which you may recognize from the Steeler helmet. Steelers are the only one of the only team that has their logo on only one side of their helmet, and they're the only organization that has been able to change what's inside of the Steel Mark to Steelers, and so we really enjoy when they go to the Super Bowl. The Steel Market Development Institute was formed a number of years ago to concentrate on different markets within our industry. And you can see from the investor companies on the left-hand side, and then also our partner alliances. We work with a lot of steel industry organizations and support them in their efforts as well. The Steel Recycling Institute is part of the SMDI Sustainability Group, and here is our number of employees. Both Brandy Sebastian and myself work for the SRI, and then Mark and Kishore work for SMDI directly. The Steel Recycling Institute has changed over the years. We've kind of changed our mission. We've become more of a research and a research organization in terms of we're a clearinghouse for life cycle assessment data for North American steel. We develop life cycle assessment studies and also develop environmental product declarations for various steel products. We also track energy data for North American steel. This one last tidbit on the bottom shows that we've done a lot of things to decrease our use of energy, or energy intensity, if you will, over the last 20 plus years, and been very successful at it. One thing that hasn't changed for the Steel Recycling Institute, we are still a big supporter of recycling organizations across the country. As Wayne mentioned from my bio, we belong to and try to be active in all of the state recycling organizations across the country. And as Wayne also mentioned, I am very active in various organizations, both at the national, regional level. We also encourage all the folks on the call today, the webinar today, to either join these organizations or sponsor or support these organizations in your own way. Now, let's get to the nitty-gritty. Why do we recycle steel? It saves a tremendous amount of natural materials, but most importantly, it saves a tremendous amount of energy. I think from the last slide, you can see that we save so much energy from steel recycling that you could power 20 million homes over the course of a year. So it's a very important part. And I believe that all materials, plastics, glass, paper, and other materials are similar in their energy savings. So, but it's a necessary part of steel recycling or the steel industry because our use of energy is very intensive as well. But as I mentioned, we have reduced that consumption by about 31% since 1990. One other thing to remember is that if you take all of the materials combined, paper, aluminum, glass, and plastics, they still don't come close to the recycling effort of the steel industry. Steel is the most recycled material in North America, and I know that our friends in the asphalt and concrete industry have some concerns or something to say about that, but until we sit down over a beer, we'll continue saying that. Why is that? Is because steel is magnetic. It's the easiest material to pull out of any type of recycling program that your community or your jurisdictions decides to put in place, either drop off, curbside collection, single stream, buyback, or waste energy. The steel can be pulled out with the magnet. Also, it helps that we have over 100 melting facilities across the country, and rely on the 2,600 scrap dealers across the country that bring that material to us. Where to recycle steel is a little bit dated picture or map of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which shows where the steel mills are located. You can see there's a big concentration near the Great Lakes. Indiana has just celebrated its 42nd straight year of being the top steel producing state in the country. There's also a lot of activity down in the southeast, especially in Alabama. That's where a lot of the car companies are also have moved to. And then, of course, there's still some activity in the northeast. There are two types of steel furnaces used in the production of steel today. The basic the basic auction furnace or integrated mill produces about 40% of the overall steel production. It uses about between 25 to 35% steel scrap in making that steel in that type of furnace. The other type of steel furnace is electric arc furnace or mini mill. Currently, about 60% of all steel production in the U.S. is made with the mini mill or electric arc furnace. And it can have virtually 100% recycled steel scrap in its process. It depends on what type of product it's making. For example, some type of structural steel may have 90-95% recycled content in the use of iron ore pellets, or some rebar may be virtually 100% recycled scrap in its process. So depends on what they're making in that type of furnace. But when I started 35 plus years ago in the industry, the basic auction furnace was the dominant way to make steel, and then the mini mill was catching up quickly. Now it's completely taken its place. So this is a very busy slide, but the main thing to take away from it, both the electric arc furnace and the basic auction furnace systems both use recycled steel scrap in its process. It also uses some form of iron or iron pellet. It may come in the form of pig iron, which is the product of the blast furnace, or it may come from iron pellets that are made in a different method. But the main thing is you have to have old steel to make new steel, and all steel furnaces use recycled steel in some form of pellets. This is a graph that from the American metal market that we provide data, the AISI provides data for. It shows the weekly tonnage of raw steel production. And as you can see from the dark blue line, we're heading in the right direction. Just last week, there's reported that we achieved a 79.1% capacity utilization, which historically we've been at about 75% capacity utilization. So we're headed in the right direction in terms of, and from that measurement. And so that's good. That shows the economy is going in the right direction in terms of steel production and use. To give you an idea of what capacity utilization, how effect it has on supply versus demand, this is back from before and during, after the Great Recession. You can see how the capacity utilization dipped in September, I'll just say fall of 2008, and then slowly climbed back. But you can also see in August of 2008, when we were almost 88% capacity utilization, the price of prime scrap, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, was very high. And then we saw in September, when the recession really hit in 2008, capacity utilization went down to almost 66%. And of course, the price of prime scrap went down. And then where we were in the kind of the low point of the recession and capacity utilization was less than 40%, the price really dropped, and it was a concern for everyone. And as you'll see in a few minutes, we've bounced back considerably from there. The world steel market, the world steel production is about 1.6 billion tons. China makes over half of that at 8.3 million tons. I'm sorry, 831 million metric tons. And the United States is quite a ways back at about 81 million metric tons. You can see from the left-hand side, you can see where China is compared to other countries. And just to note, India in the last 12 months has made a significant increase in their production from about 85 million metric tons to where they are now at 101.4 million tons. You can also see from the right-hand side um, who are the top exporters of steel. China obviously is number one. Then comes Japan, South Korea, and then the United States all the way at 16. But we are still, unfortunately, the top importer of imported steel, but at about 35.7 million metric tons, which, if you do the math, we're close to half of what our actual production is. And just to mention, historically, imported steel has been about 15% of our marketplace. There's always a place for imported steel. The problem has been that a lot of countries have been dumping imported steel here um, throughout the last 5, 6 years, and the rate for imported steel has been more close to about 35% of the marketplace, which is almost a little more than double. So that's why I think you're seeing some of the issues in terms of trade and tariffs that you're seeing put into place, and see if we can correct that and get to a more of a fair trade system versus what they call free trade. Here's some historical pie graphs that shows that China does dominate world production. And it's my understanding they use about 400 million tons. They have a use of 400 million tons of their production. So the other half needs to find a home. And unfortunately, it's finding its place elsewhere in the world. Another graph, another way to look at it, very distinct. There are a lot of, there are 316 grades of steel scrap according to ISRI, the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. But we like to break it down into three simple areas. Home scrap is the scrap that's generated in the steelmaking process. For example, if the customer's order calls for a 30-foot beam, but the beam comes out 32 feet, they'll weld off that extra 2 feet and then put it back into the process. That's home scrap. Prom scrap is the scrap that's generated during the manufacturing process. You can see the picture on the right. It's actually the skeleton of the sheet or the plate after the part is stamped out or cut out. That material gets put back sold back to the steel industry. Uh, and sometimes it doesn't even make it to market. It's done by contract basis. But that's considered prop scrap and very desirable form of scrap because you know exactly what you're getting. The third is obsolete scrap, and that's what we're talking about mostly today, is the steel products that have reached their end of useful life and get recycled back into the process. Here is a number of percentages. It shows our overall recycling rates for various steel products. You can see they're very high. For example, containers or steel cans have about a 71% recycling rate. So more than 2 out of every 3 cans gets recycled. And then automobiles is your most recycled consumer product because of the steel content. Appliances the same way. And then your construction, you seldom have a demolition project where there's not a roll off there for your steel scrap. Let's talk about steel cans for a moment. When you talk about steel cans in the marketplace, 90% of your steel cans are the food cans that are out there. Another 7% of your empty aerosol cans, or your aerosol cans, and the other 3% of your paint cans. And the steel industry would like have them all back. Steel cans represent about 2% of our production, and they'll easily absorb back into the system when they're recycled. Now, often you hear in the last couple of years about the evolving ton of recyclables out there. And our concern is twofold, is that you have a product, the Star-Kissed tuna can that's made of steel, and it's being replaced or displaced, if you will, by the flexible pouch. The flexible pouch is a very interesting packaging. There's a lot of sustainable attributes that make it worthwhile. The concern we have is that not only does it displace the steel cans, but also when it is recycled or put in the recycling bin due to wishful recycling, it then becomes flat and it mixes in with the fiber in the recycling stream and then contaminates the fiber because it's basically one dimensional, if you will. So that's a concern there. Now, obviously, there's a lot of work by that industry to make this more recycled, make this recyclable, and hopefully there'll be a system to do that. The other issue we have, and I want to shout out to the Association of Plastic Recyclers, because when there was a proposed plastic vegetable can um, coming to market, they railed against it because of the fact that not only are you contaminating uh, the steel industry with the excess plastic, but you're also contaminating the plastics stream with the steel lid and the ring, if you will, that's left over. So it's my understanding that that was pulled from market. I'm not sure where that stands now, but once again, you're displacing a recyclable product with something that may or may not be recycled properly. There's a lot of facts available at cancentral.com, and one of the two interesting ones I find is that 80 to 90% of all steel ever produced is still in commerce, which is great. Little historical fact: what made Napoleon so successful in his efforts to conquer Europe was the fact that they invented steel cans or tin cans prior to that, and then they always say that an army moves on its stomach. So more information like that is available at cancentral.com. Let's talk about aerosol cans. Over 5,900 programs across the country, curbside drop-off, obviously waste energy, include empty aerosol cans in their steel can mix. 72 of the top 100 programs include them. And then according to the recent access to recycling study that was done by SPC, over 70% of Americans have access to recycling of empty aerosol cans. And as the logo says, please recycle when empty. Let's move to paint cans. Approximately 4,800 programs across the country include empty paint cans. And what we're looking for is not last year's garage project with 2 inches at the bottom, but we're looking for paint cans with only a dry skin of paint that is completely dry. And of course, the can should, or the lid off the container should be recycled as well, but it should be left off the container so that we can make sure that the can is empty. For those who haven't been to their hardware store lately, you may see a lot of plastic paint cans, but I just want to let you know that we still control about 55% of the paint can market. So recycle your paint cans. Switching to automobiles, for the last 5 decades, while the overall mass or weight of the vehicle has come down, the percentage of steel in those vehicles throughout those 5 decades has remained fairly constant, between 58 and 59%. So, and as I mentioned before, the automobile is the most recycled consumer product because of its metal content, both steel and non-ferrous. There's been a lot of efforts by the automobile industry to lightweight their vehicles, as I mentioned. They've looked at other materials instead of steel to achieve these. And as you can see, there are concerns there because during the production phase of those lightweight materials, their greenhouse gas emissions are considerably higher than they are for steel. And so the steel industry has been very aggressive in developing new steels that are stronger, but can be made in a way that reduces the overall mass of those products going to the automobiles. So looking at that, we did a life cycle assessment study on vehicles, and we looked at these issues that you see on your screen now. And here's a couple of conclusions: is that when you're lightweighting with aluminum versus high alloy strength steel, you actually increase the production emissions for all vehicles. And because of some concerns about the recycling, you actually reduce the environmental impact in greenhouse gas emissions by using the new steels versus aluminum. And I just keep going. The main thing to remember is that no matter what type of vehicle you drive, it is the steel in that vehicle that keeps you safe. There's more information available at steel.org, which is our one of our websites. Appliances, as I mentioned, about 65% of steel is the reason is, oh, excuse me, a typical appliance is produced using 65% of steel, which is the reason why that about over 90% of all appliances are recycled every day. And of course, illegal dumping is an issue everywhere, not only for some steel products, unfortunately, but also for other materials. The thing is, when steel markets are good, you tend to see a lot less appliances being illegally dumped. And this graph shows the weekly shredded scrap price for composites. This is a combination of auto shred and also appliance shred. It fits in there, and you can see it's come down recently, and I think that's could be the issue because of Turkey went out of the market because of the tiff they're having with the Trump administration. But I could be wrong about that. But the main thing is we're much higher than the last two previous years, and it's in the right going in the right direction for the most part. As I mentioned, when you have a demolition project, you're going to see a roll off there for the structural steel that gets taken out, and this is a similar composite of the number one heavy melt, which is the grade for essentially structural steel. Once again, it's much higher than the years past, and is staying in fairly consistent in its overall range. The Steel Market Development Institute also does a lot of market development stuff, hence our name. We do a lot of upstream work in terms of research for the automobile industry. We are very encouraged by the discussions about investing in the overall infrastructure of the United States, because when you build bridges and build roads, you use a lot of steel. And then also we work with the utility industry to get them to look at using steel utility poles versus the creosote soaked wooden poles that have been a concern for a number of years. We also are very active with a number of organizations in residential steel framing and structural steel, use of structural steel in sustainable construction. We are a national member of the USGBC, and we are also a member of every chapter across the country. If folks are interested in how to use steel, the website's a little wrong there, but it's buildusingsteel.org. You can find information on how to use steel to get your lead points. And also there is the current industry level environmental product declarations that are available from the steel industry as well there. Just to give you an example or how things have changed with the steel industry, back in 1972, they built the Sears Tower, which if you're from Chicago, it will always be called the Sears Tower. It is now called the Willis Tower. But back then, about 72,000 tons of steel was used to produce that, and we estimate about a 20% recycled content. Today, if you built that tower, once again, you use about 60,000 tons, so quite a decrease in amount of steel being used. It also has a higher recycled content of close to 90%, if not higher. And then it kind of shows some of the other environmental attributes that would now take place if you built that tower using today's steel. As I mentioned earlier, we rely on the 2,600 scrap dealers across the country. They've been in business for a number of years, if not number of generations. A lot of them started out as wood and grease collectors back in the early part of the 19th century. And so they have since obviously gone to ferrous and non-ferrous and other materials. We also work very closely with the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries in both their headquarters staff and in their their local and regional chapters across the country. We always try to direct people towards ISRI members because they've got a great program in terms of environmental compliance in education and safety. So it's very important. The main thing is to know who you're working with, make sure they're doing things the right way, and I think that's important. That's why I'm very comfortable directing people towards our friends at ISRI and their members. Well, that's all the comments I have today, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave, for that really good presentation. So we're going to be doing a Q&A session right now. So if you do have a question or a comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box. So we do have a few questions already. We have two right here that have to do with aerosol cans. So the question is, what are the reasons for the 30% of curbside programs do not accept cans or aerosol cans?
There's a number of reasons. Institutional memory. A lot of folks think they still have CFCs and just destroy the ozone. So there's philosophical issues with aerosol cans. And unfortunately, we have close to 25, or actually more than that, about 25 years of experience, including empty aerosol cans, with MRFs and other and programs including them. And so there's a lot of peer-to-peer research and data out there. Folks have been doing it for such a long time. The other reason could be that I haven't got to their market yet. It may be a local scrap dealer they deal with. Once again, scrap dealers do not, and actually the steel mill itself, try not to accept sealed units, such as shock absorbers, for example, is an issue. So they need to be unsealed, if you will. And propane cylinders are an issue. They need to be vented or opened up in some way. And so folks think that that is the same way that they should include aerosols in that sealed unit, especially the scrap dealers think that. But aerosols, we have data and research that shows when you process them along with other types of steel cans, that they are significantly vented enough and crushed enough that they're not considered a sealed unit, so they cause no issues at the steel mill level.
Yeah, this one I think you pretty much answered the question, but they asked if you could speak about the empty aerosol cans that have been used for HHW sprays versus like the food or non-HHW aerosols. And this the person who posed this question, they're from Connecticut, and they're told not to recycle empty HHW aerosol cans like spray cans, automotive cleaners, and things like that.
There are programs across the country that allow empty aerosols that are not those type of containers. It's been our research. We've done a thing down in Houston, Texas, where we determine how empty is empty. So we included the information about aerosol can recycling in the educational materials for the city of Houston. And then every Tuesday, we actually segregated the aerosol cans out of the steel can mix that was collected through the curbside program. We weighed the cans, cut them open, wiped them clean, and then weighed them again to determine if the cans were what we call RCRA empty, which is 3% of less of the original content. And from that study, we did it over a number of weeks, and we found that the cans are considered RCRA empty. And then we used that information to go to the US EPA back in 1993, and we have a letter of support from them for empty aerosol can recycling. Majority of your aerosol products are water-based or aqueous-based chemistries, if you will. So, if you include empty aerosol cans but don't include the spray paints and other things, that is up to you. My concern is that if you provide education that if the can is empty, it should be recycled. If it's full or partially full, it should go to HHW, because it's been my experience that when that can is recycled through an HHW processor or vendor, there is a significant charge per can for that. And that's a concern that I have. So, and if those cans are all going towards HHW program, that's kind of a waste of resources for that city or agency or municipality. So that's my concern there.
Dave, can you comment on the relative impact on the recyclable steel market due to the China import policies versus the new U.S. tariff policies?
Well, I always like to say before I comment about tariffs, my main goal is to keep my job. So, as I mentioned in my one of the few slides, we have members from the domestic members, but also Canadian, Mexico members, and some of our members are getting hurt by the tariffs because they're put into that process where they get exempted, and it's taken a lot longer than was expected. And other members are benefiting. The main thing is that we have seen a number of steel mills come back online in terms of they've been laid off for or closed down for 2 or 3 years because of imported steel. And so those facilities and those workers are coming back. And all told, there's about 12 facilities, about 5,000 steel workers that were laid off during that time period. And how that hits home is that, for instance, Granite City Steel, a U.S. steel facility near St. Louis, is opening back up as we speak. And there's about 500 families that are going to benefit from the good paying jobs. One of the workers was interviewed after it was one of their workers who was coming back to that mill was interviewed after that was announced, and he said that he actually was working 2 full-time jobs to make the same amount of money that he made working at the steel mill. So he is actually going to work less by going back to that when that mill opens back up. So that's a good thing. Now, a lot of folks have said, well, only 2%. China only sends 2% of their steel to the United States, and that could be true. Our concern is what I call the domino effect, or my concern, I should say, is that China sends their steel everywhere across the world. The EU, other parts of Asia, South America, for example, and of course, the United States, or I should say North America. And so the steel that's produced in those countries then gets displaced and goes elsewhere, like the United States. So there's a domino effect in some ways. There's also been cases that I've read about where China has been sending steel to, for example, Vietnam. The steel products get repackaged and remanifested, if you will, and then it gets sent over here. So that's why some of that China steel does not get counted. The main thing is, I think that if you look at the tariff issue, both that not the ones that we've been put into place in this so-called trade war, but the ones that existed prior to that, every country has some form of tariffs. And I think we're hoping that this current situation leads to more of a fair trade system than we have now. It's hard to call it free trade when certain countries are charging tariffs on certain products. So maybe we'll get to a more fair trade is what we're hoping, I think.
Okay. What direction do you see the pricing for scrap steel cans heading into 2019 as the National Sword/Blue Sky regulations play out? Thinking in particular of the impact on MRF operators or local governments that rely on revenue share payments from the recycling collectors.
I was at a conference last week that somebody asked that question: when we're going to see the effects of the current programs, the tariffs, the tariffs, things like that affect the price of scrap. And that's the reason I showed that one breakdown of what happened before and during the Great Recession. when you have an increase in capacity utilization, you're going to see the price of scrap go up. So I think that if our economy stays strong, and if we spend any of that $1 trillion they're talking about for infrastructure, we should see a pretty strong market for steel scrap over the next few years. No one has a crystal ball, but I think I think you'll see that the steel cans collected in recycling programs, that they'll provide some type of revenue source to hopefully offset some of the other materials that are being devastated or drastically affected by the National Sword program. So the main thing I would like to say there is we should all look at maximizing the materials that have strong markets, especially domestically, such as steel, and various plastics, various paper products, and maximize those materials and educate to that effect is my main thing. But maximize your steel diversion when it comes to steel cans by including empty aerosols and empty paint cans, as well as maximizing food can diversion as well. Thank you.
Okay. So, I mean, I don't know if any of our attendees have actually attended the NRC is having quarterly market development webinars. We've had one in March and one in June, and I think the next one's scheduled for September. And the focus of those webinars are specifically on the China import restrictions. So if you want to obtain more information on this issue and how it's impacting recycling in our country and our states, you can go to the either National Recycling Coalition or Recycling Market Center websites, and we have those webinars recorded for your viewing. So
yeah, let me mention that, Wayne, real quickly. The National Recycling Coalition has really decided to try to take a lead on the market development issue that's facing our industry. And as Wayne mentioned, there was a market development webinars. That was a program that the NRC reinvigorated. The US EPA used to do a very similar one. Program is mostly quarterly calls of economic development officials and try to get them to look at recycling, development of recycling markets as an economic development issue, which it is, obviously. It means jobs and things like that. But so the NRC decided to reinstitute this program, and our goal there is to get more economic development professionals involved in those quarterly calls or webinars, as Wayne mentioned. I also want to mention that the NRC is doing regional market development workshops. Our first one was on April 4th in Portland, Oregon. Very effective. About 144 people attended that. And then our second was on July 31st down near Atlanta, Georgia. And what's interesting about those is that different parts of the country, different regions, if you will, have different concerns. Whereas Portland, the Northwest, exported a lot of the materials to China, so they're really affected by the National Sword program. Whereas the Southeast has a lot of domestic markets for most material, and so their main concern there was developing programs that collect a quality material. So the nuances of those workshops are different. We are planning for another one in November in Chicago area. And then, of course, the NRC also is working with the Resource Recycling Conference in St. Louis on October 22nd through 24th. NRC is organizing 3 sessions along with a markets town hall, which we'll be discussing the 2 workshops that took place already and what's coming out of those workshops in terms of some type of end product, if you will, a report, best practices, resources, that type of thing. So we're very encouraged about the interest and the participation in those type of programs so far. So as Wayne mentioned, go to the Pennsylvania Recycling Markets Council website or the National Recycling Coalition website and find out more information about that. We welcome your participation.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So it looks like we're done with the questions, so we're gonna wrap it up here. So again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Dave, for taking time out for this presentation. And we hope you will join us for next month's webinar. Please visit the NRC and RMC websites for schedule updates. And have a great day, everybody.